Hey teens, today we're going to be looking at Mr. Edgar Allan Poe. We're going to get you comfortable with who he was and his writing mostly today. So we're going to look at some of the genres he wrote. First, he was a critic. Mr. Edgar Allan Poe spent most of his time reviewing other people's writing. In fact, he reviewed one of his own poems, The Raven, and talked about just how amazing it was and how much better than other people's writing he was. He was pretty up on his own stuff, but he was pretty good most of the time too, so he kind of deserves some of the accolades. He also wrote what we call psychological fiction. Psychological fiction is his word for the more horror-themed content that we associate with him. He called it psychological fiction because he was more afraid of and kind of focused more on the scary things within than the scary things without. It wasn't scary monsters and skeletons and stuff. It was insanity and the worry that the majority of the dangers is inside your own mind, which is a scary thought, of course. And he invented, and I'll move back just a tad there, the detective story. He invented it, guys. He even before Sherlock Holmes was a thing, he was writing stories like Murders in the Rue Morgue that had the detective gathering the evidence, figuring out who the killer is, that final chase down of figuring out who it is. That has been the backbone of so many mystery and crime shows for the past 150 years. So we can all thank Edgar Allan Poe for coming up with the idea of it. So he invented the detective story. He is also associated with Gothic writing. The Gothic is not what he would have said he wrote in, though. His contemporaries, people who wrote around the same time as him, wrote Gothic literature. This is a more British form of literature. It combined romance with horror. And when I say romance, I'm not talking about the grossy, kissy stuff. I'm talking fantasy, supernatural, even like some adventure stories and stories about like King Arthur and stuff like that were considered romance. It's really important that most of his British contemporaries did it because he was an American, actually. A lot of people lump him in that way, but he was an American writer. And he just used the more European aspects to kind of talk about stuff. Once again, he didn't write Gothic stories. In fact, he only really incorporated those things because that was the style that people were primarily writing in at the time. He wanted to tell tales of terror, not of Germany, but of the soul. And so he more focused on the psychological aspects. So some elements that Gothic that he did use, because it is important to kind of notice what kinds of things he does, is first of all a grim setting. In this, and this is a really important one, this one's the one that matters most for our stories, that landscapes are often reflections of a character's mind. Our story is shrouded in darkness, takes place in one building in one location, and that is also reflective of the way the main character thinks. He's all in darkness except for only focusing on one thing, because he's obsessed and maybe mentally unstable. Other elements, things like hidden evil, the idea that we are hiding our crimes, that they are not happening under daylight, but they are happening under cover of darkness. And other Gothic writers also took this opportunity. It was the first time ever that like blood and guts and body parts were actually a kind of a popular thing to include in your stories, just to gross people out for grossing people out's sake. Maniacal laughter. This is a little bit of that psychological element that Poe really wanted to bring out. And deformity. This was a classic one in Frankenstein. Frankenstein being one of the most famous of the novels of the Gothic era. This is the idea that the grotesque, people who have problems with their outward appearance might be magical or evil or something like that. Kind of a backwards way of thinking than the way we think today, but back then that was just a common convention. And so those are the Gothic elements that he uses. But he focused more heavily on the psychological aspects. So madness is a very common element in all of his stories. He focuses on the psychological aspects of his characters. And often the main character or narrator will be stricken with mental instability. That's an important piece of the couple of stories we are going to read, because that is a scarier thought. Losing your own mind and what you think and know as reality is actually not reality. That's a terrifying prospect. So hopefully you guys make sure you wrote all the stuff down. All the stuff is supposed to be in your notebook there, underlined. And I guess that's it. That's Edgar Allan Poe. Lombardo out.